Hey everybody, thanks for joining me, and today I'm going to be talking about the history of narratives in video games, history of storytelling in video games, and I'm going to be playing a little bit of a MGS while I do so, a perfect example of the genre if I do say so myself. Alright, so to begin with, obviously most of the earliest games didn't have any sort of story at all. You know, they were just things like Pong, Space War. Yeah, they didn't have any stories at all. They were just, really just a program you could kind of barely interact with and would just respond to button presses. And that was it, really. And that, goes on throughout the early 70s with things like the Magnavox Odyssey and so on and so forth, right? So then in the era following that, the late 70s, early 80s, with the release of the Atari 2600, sort of begins that era, and, you'd buy a game and then it'd have some flavor text in the instruction manual that basically just said stuff about what the kinds of characters were that you were controlling and what the things on the screen were that you were supposed to be interacting with. I mean, there was, I don't know, a plot in the loosest sense of the word. It was really just, the plot is barely there. It's really just something to kind of frame the gameplay and the interactions within, right? So, entering the next generation of home consoles with the NES, or Famicom as it was called in Japan, that's still kind of true. Many games, again, don't really have very in-depth stories. Very frequently they're just plots are again just used as excuses to frame the gameplay and the kind of levels around. It's some woman has been kidnapped, your girlfriend has been kidnapped, or the president has been kidnapped. Go out and fight your way through 8 different levels to get to him. That said, we do see some exceptions to that in this era. Games like Dragon Warrior, Ninja Gaiden actually have plots that are a little more intricate, with actual characterization and like a narrative arc of sorts. And there's also some early stabs at the survival horror genre and building a creepy atmosphere with sort of this limited technology, and you see that in games like Uninvited and Sweet Home. Although that was Japan only, so we never saw that stateside. So, carrying on from that, we get into the fourth console generation. The fourth console generation was the era of the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis. That time period of the late 80s to early 90s also sees the release of the Game Boy. So throughout this time frame, we see narratives in games that are actually starting to get fairly complex, with games that actually require scripts and writers and have narrative arcs and characters you actually kind of give a shit about. You could make an argument that this is kind of the golden age of the console RPG. Games like Earthbound, Chrono Trigger, Final Fantasy, the JRPG really hits its stride in this area, and they bring us some really interesting and intricate worlds and stories. Now, you should already be cognizant of a trend that is emerging, that as technology gets more sophisticated, the kinds of stories games can tell expands. Though at the same time, I think one could make an argument that this sort of race for better graphics, the so-called bit wars that was going on throughout these generations, might arguably be thought of as a hindrance to stories in games, so it's complicated. Now, moving right along into the fifth generation, that is the generation of the Sony PlayStation and N64, we start to see narratives in games becoming quite a bit more complex. with interesting twists and turns along the way, with stories that unfold more like a novel or more like a movie. I think some good examples of this would be like Final Fantasy VII, and the way that game's story sort of unfolds and branches out. I think for people of my age group, around my age group, a lot of people say that Aeris's death, that the death of Aeris was really kind of one of the first moments in a game that actually like made them cry, or really like made them really kind of feel something for the characters and realize that they had really gotten really invested in that world. Yeah, spoilers, by the way, for a game that's now, like, almost 20 years old. And then there was the Zelda series at that time. Both Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. And I'd say Majora's Mask, more than Ocarina of Time, actually, was that was really, really based around the exploration of characters and more kind of like literary themes. Like loss and growing older and things like that. And both of those games were really great. You know, both Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask succeeded in painting this world that felt like that it somewhat existed independently of the characters' actions. Succeeded in creating a world that actually responded to your actions. So that was really cool to see the world come alive in that sort of way. And then, of course, I would be remiss to go on without mentioning the original Metal Gear Solid. That was definitely one of the first games I can remember playing where I really, really got absorbed into that world and into the characters and got invested in the story that unfolded. And that's the comment that everyone made about that game at that time. Going back and reading reviews from that era now, all the reviews say things like, you know, it's like playing a Hollywood movie. And I think it is very much one of the games that kind of paved the way for the act of telling a story in the game to be taken a little more seriously. This trend carries over, of course, into the 6th generation, the era of the PS2, the GameCube, the Xbox. Stories and games get more in-depth and more expansive, and this charge continues to be led by sort of by the staple franchises of the various consoles, Final Fantasy, Metal Gear Solid 2 and 3, Legend of Zelda, Twilight Princess, and Wind Waker, and then of course some newcomers like Halo and Fable. So in the era of the PS3, the 360, and the Wii, we see a lot more story-based games coming out. However, many of these games sacrifice difficulty for storytelling, and you'll frequently hear people complain that modern-day games are not as difficult as games in the past, and that's certainly true, but I honestly don't mind it that much. I mean, it does come from the fact that a lot of people want to be able to see the narrative of a game through to its completion and find out what happens. And, you know, if you're not good at a game, that can be a real impediment to enjoying its story. So, yeah, they've sort of scaled back the difficulty on many games, but you can't just compensate for that by just playing on a higher difficulty level. So it doesn't bother me that much. I think the other interesting thing of note in this previous generation was the varying kinds of narratives in games that come out during this era. Was that the market begins to open up to independent developers a lot more. So now it's not just so we see that, you know, it isn't any longer just these AAA, these big companies that are able to tell the sorts of stories they want to tell, but now small-time developers and independent developers and just people with really cool ideas for games and narratives are able to step up to the plate and have and have people experience the sorts of things that they want to put out into the world. Of course, at the same time as technology continues to increase in this era, games become more expensive to produce, but the trade-off for that is that they become much more immersive, with like almost all of the AAA games being motion captured. So many of the games in the 7th generation just began to feel that much more immersive and that much more realistic as a result. And then today, where I'm making this video from, the era of the PS4, the Xbox One, and the Wii U, that same sort of trend has largely continued over. Games just continue to get more expansive, with bigger, larger worlds, and a lot of little details and side quests that help flesh out the world the game takes place in, aside from just the main plot or the main narrative of the game. So more and more we're seeing games having multiple narratives, not just one. And the same sort of trend for ease of access and to technology and ease of creation for independent game developers continues. And I think we're seeing more diverse sorts of stories in games as a result. More diverse narrative or storytelling techniques. Just looking at some of the top games of last year, Bloodborne, The Witcher 3, and Life is Strange. All three of those games sort of tell their stories in completely different fashions. Bloodborne, it's very kind of minimalist in its presentation, and the game expects you to piece together the lore and story and kind of infer what happens by yourself. The Witcher 3, is this kind of epic journey that your choices have impacts on the story and how things ultimately wrap up in the end. And then Life is Strange is, is an indie developed game, and it's more about being able to see the different ramifications of different choices. So yeah, it's clear that as a storytelling medium, games have come very far from their rather humble beginnings in not that long of a time span either, really, if you think about it. Only like 40 years or so. And what does the future for the genre hold? I think, I guess my sort of humble prediction is that as technology continues to get better, we're going to see new and interesting ways of immersing the player in the world of the game. And developers are just going to have all these wonderful tools at their disposal to tell just about any kind of story that they can think of. So, yeah, as far as I'm concerned, the future's looking pretty bright. Anyway, thanks for watching this kind of rambling retrospective on the history of narratives in games, and yeah, thanks for watching. I'll see you later.